In the heart of the Mediterranean world on the island of Sicily there was a young princess named Lanassa, born to Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse. Lanassa's life began amidst the complex politics and turmoil that defined the ancient world. Syracuse, a flourishing city-state, sat on the eastern coast of the island, a beacon of Greek culture, influence, and power in the western Mediterranean. It was a time of great upheaval, with shifting alliances and looming threats from the powerful Carthaginian Empire, the rising tide of Roman expansion, and the internal strife that often characterized the power struggles within the Greek colonies. Lanassa, the daughter of Agathocles, was not just any princess. She was a key player in a world that revolved around political maneuvering, alliances, and the pursuit of power. Her father, Agathocles, had risen to power through a combination of military skill, ambition, and ruthless tactics, having started as a humble potter before seizing control of Syracuse and eventually declaring himself tyrant. Under his reign, Syracuse reached the height of its power. But this came at the cost of political instability, internal conspiracies, and constant warfare. Lanassa's childhood was shaped by the ruthless nature of her father's reign. Her early years were spent within the walls of the palace, where the court was filled with whispers of political intrigues, military campaigns, and the ever-present threat of assassination. Despite the danger that surrounded her, Lanassa was educated in the ways of diplomacy, strategy, and leadership, skills that would later serve her in the tumultuous years ahead. Syracuse at the time was a city-state of great importance in the Mediterranean world. Its strategic location made it a key player in the ongoing struggles between the Greeks, Carthaginians, and the emerging Roman power. Lanassa's upbringing in this environment was one of privilege, but also one of constant pressure. From a young age, she was groomed to understand the importance of alliances and the political weight her marriage could carry. Her education was overseen by the finest tutors, who taught her not only the arts of governance but also the delicate balance of maintaining power through marriage and diplomacy. Her father, ever the pragmatist, understood the value of strong alliances through marriage, and it was clear to him that Lanassa would one day be a pawn in the grand game of Mediterranean politics. Yet, Lanassa's beauty and intellect were not merely tools for her father's ambitions. She was also a young woman of considerable will, whose understanding of power and politics would shape her destiny in unexpected ways. While other young women of her status were often relegated to the more traditional roles of domesticity, Lanassa was keenly aware of her unique position and the influence she could wield. Her early life, though marked by the glories and dangers of Syracuse's political landscape, was also one of personal growth. She observed her father's many political maneuvers, learning the art of negotiation and the necessity of maintaining composure amidst chaos. Syracuse was a city that thrived on competition both within the court and on the battlefield, and Lanassa was shaped by the environment that surrounded her. As she entered her teenage years, it became evident that her father had ambitions beyond Syracuse itself. The political alliances he sought were not just local, but extended across the Mediterranean, aiming to place Syracuse at the center of a wider network of power. This ambition would soon lead to a pivotal moment in Lanassa's life, one that would change the course of her destiny forever. In the year 295 BC, a marriage alliance was arranged that would connect Lanassa to one of the most ambitious and charismatic leaders in the Mediterranean world, Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus, a man whose reputation for military prowess and ambition was quickly spreading, was seeking to solidify his power and extend his reach. His kingdom of Epirus, located in the rugged mountainous region of northern Greece, was strategically positioned between the Greek world and the Illyrian coast. However, despite his military successes, Pyrrhus was still in need of powerful allies to secure his position against his many rivals, including the growing might of Rome. For Lanassa, this marriage was not one of love, but rather a political maneuver, a union of two powerful families seeking to forge a lasting alliance. The decision was made swiftly, and Lanassa, despite her youth, found herself betrothed to Pyrrhus, a man she had never met but whose ambition was already legendary. It was a match that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Lanassa but for the future of the Mediterranean world. At the age of 16, Lanassa was sent to Epirus to marry Pyrrhus. She left behind the familiar sights and sounds of Syracuse for the unknown terrain of northern Greece, where the mountains rose sharply against the sky and the winds carried whispers of war. Her journey to Epirus marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would see her transformed from a princess of Syracuse into a queen consort of Epirus, playing a pivotal role in the geopolitical struggles of the time. In Epirus, Lanassa would find herself in a foreign land surrounded by a court that was very different from the one she had known in Syracuse. Pyrrhus, though a man of great ambition and military genius, was also deeply entrenched in the constant struggle for power. The court of Epirus was a place of intrigue where alliances were fragile and betrayal was always a looming threat. Yet, Lanassa was not one to shy away from challenges. She quickly adapted to her new role as queen consort, using her keen mind and diplomatic skills to navigate the complexities of Epiro politics. Her influence at court grew steadily as Pyrrhus, consumed with his military campaigns, increasingly relied on her to manage the affairs of the kingdom in his absence. She was not merely a passive figurehead but an active participant in the decision-making processes that shaped the destiny of Epirus. Her political acumen and ability to forge alliances would soon prove invaluable, especially as Pyrrhus turned his attention to the rising threat of Rome. Lanassa's life in Epirus was one of contrast, a delicate balance between the expectations of a queen and the realities of power. She had been raised in the turbulent environment of Syracuse, but the political landscape of Epirus was even more complex and volatile. The first years of her marriage to Pyrrhus were marked by both triumphs and struggles, as she navigated the intricate web of court politics and her growing influence. In the midst of it all, Lanassa remained a figure of quiet strength, embodying the resilience of the Mediterranean women who had been raised to understand the intricate dance of power, diplomacy, and survival. Little did she know that the choices she made in the coming years would not only shape the future of Epirus but also leave an indelible mark on the history of the Mediterranean world. As Lanassa settled into her new role as queen consort in Epirus, she found herself in the midst of a foreign and often harsh environment. The kingdom, though strategically located, was not without its challenges. Pyrrhus, a man of remarkable talent and ambition, had inherited a realm that was struggling with its own internal divisions and external threats. His leadership was marked by military conquest, and he was determined to carve out a place for Epirus among the great powers of the Mediterranean. Unlike the relative peace that had characterized her upbringing in Syracuse, Lanassa now found herself in the thick of ongoing military campaigns. Pyrrhus, situated in the rugged mountains of northern Greece, had a kingdom that was geographically isolated, and yet its leaders always harbored aspirations of grandeur. Pyrrhus, though admired for his strength as a military leader, faced constant struggles with neighboring states and internal dissent. His rise to power was no easy feat, and his ambitions to expand Epirus' influence throughout the Greek world required not only military might but strategic alliances. It was here, in this turbulent environment, that Lanassa's role began to take on a new significance. As the wife of Pyrrhus, she was not just a symbolic figurehead, her position became central to his political strategy. With Pyrrhus often away, leading his troops into battle or engaging in diplomacy with neighboring powers, Lanassa was left behind in the capital to manage the kingdom's affairs. Despite the relative powerlessness that often came with the role of a queen consort, Lanassa proved herself to be an astute and capable ruler in her own right. She navigated the challenges of ruling a kingdom fraught with intrigue, conflict, and uncertainty with a quiet yet unyielding resolve. Her early education had prepared her for such a role. The political savvy she had honed in Syracuse was now put to the test in the ever-complicated world of Epirus. Pyrrhus's absence allowed Lanassa to build alliances of her own. She sought to strengthen the ties between Epirus and the other Greek states, particularly those along the western coast of Italy and Sicily. The alliance with Syracuse was important, but Lanassa was shrewd enough to recognize that a broader network of allies could serve as a more secure foundation for Epirus. She reached out to the neighboring Greek states, offering her diplomatic skills to secure peace treaties and strategic pacts that could bolster Pyrrhus's military ambitions. However, even as Lanassa built alliances, the political landscape of Epirus remained precarious. Pyrrhus, in his quest for military glory, often disregarded the practicalities of governance in favor of his campaigns. The constant warfare took a toll on the people of Epirus, and many began to question whether the cost of Pyrrhus's dreams of empire was worth the suffering it caused. In this atmosphere, Lanassa's role became increasingly vital. She acted as a stabilizing force within the kingdom, advocating for the needs of the people and ensuring that the day-to-day governance of Epirus did not collapse under the weight of constant military campaigns. While Pyrrhus's attention was fixed on his battles and conquests, Lanassa sought to maintain order at home. She worked to ensure that the royal court remained functional, that the nobility was kept in check, and that the kingdom's economy was sustained through trade and diplomacy. Her ability to manage the internal affairs of the kingdom allowed Pyrrhus to focus on his military campaigns without worrying about the immediate stability of his realm. Yet, despite Lanassa's growing influence and her effective management of the kingdom, her position as queen was not without its challenges. The constant warfare and Pyrrhus's obsession with his military goals created a distance between them. Their relationship, once a political union forged in the fires of ambition, began to grow strained as time went on. Pyrrhus's relentless pursuit of military glory, while initially seen as the path to securing his kingdom's future, began to alienate Lanassa, who had been raised to understand the delicate balance between power and diplomacy. As Pyrrhus's military campaigns stretched on, Lanassa's frustration grew. The queen, once an integral part of the political strategy in Epirus, now found herself increasingly sidelined by her husband's preoccupation with conquest. The continuous warfare was taking a toll on her personally, and her role at court became more focused on maintaining order and stability rather than exerting political influence. She began to question whether the sacrifices made for Pyrrhus's dream of empire were truly worth it. It was around this time that the tension between the Epirote king and queen began to surface. Lanassa's frustrations with Pyrrhus's single-minded pursuit of military conquest were matched by the growing dissatisfaction of the court. While Pyrrhus's victories in battle were celebrated, they came at a tremendous cost. The casualties suffered in each campaign were staggering, and the loss of experienced soldiers threatened the kingdom's ability to maintain its standing in the Mediterranean. Pyrrhus, despite his brilliance as a military commander, was often blinded by his ambition, leaving Lanassa to manage the fallout from his decisions. As she watched her husband's relentless pursuit of glory continue, Lanassa's sense of duty to Epirus grew even stronger. She was determined to maintain the kingdom's stability, even if it meant challenging her husband's decisions. Despite the personal sacrifices she had made for the marriage and the alliance between their kingdoms, Lanassa began to reconsider the costs of remaining in a relationship that increasingly felt like a political partnership rather than a union of love. In the years following their marriage, as Pyrrhus engaged in a series of campaigns against Rome, the tension between them only deepened. The long stretches of time spent apart, the mounting losses on the battlefield, and the growing disillusionment with Pyrrhus's strategies all weighed heavily on Lanassa. She began to realize that her role in Epirus would require more than just political alliances and the careful management of court affairs. To ensure the future of her kingdom, Lanassa would have to take more decisive action, both in matters of diplomacy and in her personal life. The distance between them grew, and it was only a matter of time before the strains in their marriage became irreparable. As Pyrrhus continued to push forward with his military campaigns, Lanassa made the decision that would alter the course of her life and change the trajectory of the kingdom itself. Her journey, however, was just beginning, and her decisions would soon have far-reaching consequences that would affect not only her relationship with Pyrrhus but the fate of the Mediterranean world. As Lanassa continued her life in Epirus, the marriage that had begun as a political alliance slowly turned into something far more complicated and strained. The early years of her union with Pyrrhus, once filled with the excitement of new beginnings, had begun to lose their luster. Pyrrhus's obsession with expanding his power and reputation as a military genius began to overshadow everything else in their relationship, leaving Lanassa feeling increasingly isolated. First, the queen consort had been content to support her husband, knowing that their union would help solidify Epirus' place among the great powers of the Mediterranean. The influence of Syracuse, her homeland, had granted her status and importance within the court of Epirus. Yet, as time wore on and Pyrrhus's military ambitions took precedence, Lanassa found herself quietly relegated to the role of observer, her influence slowly diminishing. Pyrrhus, renowned for his brilliant military campaigns, had become increasingly consumed with his vision of an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean. The early victories had fueled his ambition, but the costs of those victories had begun to add up. As he marched his armies against Rome, his attention was consumed by tactics, strategy, and the pursuit of military glory. In the process, he began to neglect the very kingdom he sought to protect. Pyrrhus's obsession with his military campaigns, though initially seen as a means of securing his kingdom's future, began to create a rift between the once strong partners. Lanassa, who had once played a crucial role in the administration of Epirus, found herself spending more time managing the affairs of the court and the kingdom in Pyrrhus's absence. While Pyrrhus commanded his troops on distant battlefields, Lanassa held the fort at home. Yet, despite her best efforts, the kingdom was suffering. Epirus, though strategically positioned and rich in resources, was far from invincible. The constant warfare took a toll on the economy, and the people began to grow weary of the endless campaigns. Pyrrhus's insatiable thirst for conquest had drained the kingdom of its best soldiers, and the people, who had once supported him wholeheartedly, were beginning to question the wisdom of his actions. For Lanassa, the weight of these concerns became unbearable. She had always been a pragmatist, understanding the delicate balance of power and the need for diplomatic alliances. But Pyrrhus, with his singular focus on battle, had become a leader who ignored the needs of the people he was supposed to protect. She began to see that her role as queen, which had once been a position of influence and respect, was slipping away. She was no longer a partner in governance but a caretaker of a kingdom that was unraveling at the edges. In the court of Epirus, whispers began to circulate about the queen's growing discontent. While Pyrrhus was absent, Lanassa had taken on a more prominent role in decision-making, overseeing the kingdom's internal affairs. She worked tirelessly to keep the kingdom running, managing the diplomatic ties with neighboring states, ensuring that trade routes remained open, and stabilizing the local economy. But all of this came at a personal cost. Her marriage, once a symbol of power and unity, was now an institution she no longer felt connected to. As Pyrrhus's military campaigns grew more intense, Lanassa's frustration with his relentless ambition became palpable. She was increasingly aware that his quest for military glory had become more about his personal legacy than the well-being of the people of Epirus. The victories that had once been celebrated now felt hollow. Despite the success on the battlefield, the losses on the home front were undeniable. Lanassa's disillusionment with her husband's vision reached its peak during the Battle of Asculum in 279 BC. Pyrrhus, having already suffered significant casualties in the Battle of Heraclea, was once again faced with the grim reality of a costly war against Rome. Though he emerged victorious, the price of that victory was too high: more lives lost, more resources drained, and more soldiers sent to their graves. As Pyrrhus celebrated his Pyrrhic victory, Lanassa could not ignore the mounting toll it had taken on their kingdom. From her vantage point in Epirus, Lanassa saw the political landscape growing ever more unstable. The once thriving kingdom was now strained by the constant warfare and the growing resentment of the people. She began to wonder whether Pyrrhus, in his pursuit of military greatness, had lost sight of what truly mattered: his people, his kingdom, and their future. While Pyrrhus saw himself as a conqueror, Lanassa saw the destruction left in the wake of his ambitions. Despite the growing tension between them, Lanassa remained a queen who understood the importance of alliances. She had learned early on the delicate art of diplomacy, and as her marriage to Pyrrhus continued to sour, she realized that her survival, and that of her kingdom, might depend on forging new alliances. She began to quietly reestablish ties with the leaders of other Greek states and began contemplating the possibility of returning to Syracuse. But even as Lanassa plotted her next steps, the political landscape of Epirus became increasingly volatile. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, and Pyrrhus's military focus left little room for diplomacy. The queen consort found herself caught in a difficult position. She was torn between loyalty to her husband, a man she had once believed in, and the urgent need to protect the kingdom that had entrusted her with its future. Her role at court had shifted from that of a powerful queen to that of a political pawn, caught between the ambitions of her husband and the needs of the kingdom. The alliance with Pyrrhus had once been her chance to help secure the future of Epirus, but it was now clear that the cost of that alliance had become too great. Lanassa could no longer remain passive. She had to act. The growing distance between Lanassa and Pyrrhus soon led to a dramatic change in their relationship. Lanassa's disillusionment with Pyrrhus's relentless pursuit of power, combined with the growing instability of Epirus, reached a breaking point. She began to explore her options, knowing that her next move could have far-reaching consequences not just for her, but for the future of the Mediterranean world. Lanassa's role as queen consort had never been an easy one, but the challenges she faced now were unlike any she had encountered before. The decision she would make in the coming years would set the course of her life on a new trajectory, one that would eventually lead her back to Syracuse and change the political dynamics of the entire region. But for now, the queen had to make a difficult choice: remain in a marriage that no longer served her, or take matters into her own hands and seek a new path. The alliance between Lanassa and Pyrrhus of Epirus was one that would alter the course of both their lives and the political landscape of the Mediterranean world. It was not a marriage born of love but of necessity, one forged from the shifting tides of power, where dynasties and states needed to secure their future through strategic unions. For Lanassa, this marriage was a gateway to influence and prestige, but also a heavy burden that would test her political acumen and her loyalty to her father's legacy. When the marriage between Lanassa and Pyrrhus was first proposed, it was seen as a masterstroke of diplomacy. The union was not just the joining of two powerful families but a response to the ever-growing power of Rome, which had begun its expansion in the Italian peninsula. Pyrrhus, a man of exceptional military talent and ambition, saw this marriage as a way to solidify his position among the most influential states in the Mediterranean. With the powerful Syracuse behind him, he would have a formidable ally, one that would make Epirus a serious contender in the region's power struggles. For Lanassa, the marriage was an opportunity to not only secure her own future but to elevate her family's standing. Agathocles, her father, had ruled Syracuse with an iron fist. And although his reign had been successful in some ways, it had also left the city-state vulnerable to external threats. Syracuse, like many Greek city-states, had long been embroiled in a battle for survival against both the Carthaginians and other Greek powers. Agathocles had navigated these conflicts with great cunning, but it had often come at the cost of stability. His daughter's marriage to Pyrrhus was not just a personal union, it was a political necessity. Lanassa's move to Epirus was a journey from the familiar Mediterranean shores of Syracuse to the rugged, mountainous terrain of northern Greece. Epirus, though beautiful and strategically located, was less established in terms of political infrastructure. The realm of Pyrrhus was one built on ambition, not legacy, and it was a kingdom that required constant attention to maintain its power. Upon her arrival, Lanassa found herself in a strange land, surrounded by different customs and a court that, though loyal to Pyrrhus, was rife with intrigue. The marriage to Pyrrhus itself was not without its complexities. Though the two had never met before the union, the political arrangements were clear to both parties. Lanassa, as a young and capable woman, understood her role in this grand alliance. She was not simply a wife but a political asset, a figurehead to represent the strength and influence of Syracuse in the heart of Epirus. Pyrrhus, ever the pragmatic ruler, saw her as a means to bolster his position in the Mediterranean world. But Pyrrhus was no ordinary king. His ambition knew no bounds, and his desire to leave a lasting legacy was one that would take him to distant lands and into the heart of the growing conflict with Rome. The first months of their marriage were marked by Pyrrhus's ongoing preparations for war. His goal was to carve out a place for Epirus in the wider Mediterranean sphere, particularly through military conquest. For Lanassa, this was a period of adjustment, learning the intricacies of court life, understanding the challenges her new kingdom faced, and discovering the delicate balance of power she would need to navigate. Epirus was a kingdom of warriors, and Pyrrhus was a military genius whose reputation as a tactician was beginning to spread far and wide. Though Lanassa's role in the kingdom's governance was initially limited, she quickly realized that the role of a queen consort was far more complex than she had imagined. While Pyrrhus was away leading his troops to victory and pursuing his campaigns, Lanassa was left to manage the internal affairs of the kingdom. It was a challenge that she rose to with determination, using her political savvy to ensure that the kingdom remained stable. At first, Lanassa's involvement in court politics was subtle. She took on the role of advisor, quietly shaping the decisions that were made in Pyrrhus's absence. But as the years passed, her influence at court grew. Pyrrhus's frequent military engagements kept him away for extended periods, and Lanassa found herself stepping into the vacuum left by his absence. Her ability to manage the kingdom's affairs became indispensable. While Pyrrhus focused on the battlefield, Lanassa began to foster alliances, particularly with the leaders of other Greek states and distant powers who saw her as a stabilizing force in Epirus. Though Pyrrhus was often away, his ambition cast a long shadow over the court of Epirus. The king's dreams of military conquest were not just confined to the Greek world. He sought to expand his reach into Italy, challenging the growing power of Rome. In this, Lanassa was both a partner and an observer. She supported her husband's ambitions, understanding that the survival of the kingdom depended on its ability to compete with Rome, but she also saw the dangers of constant war. It was during this time that the political dynamics of Epirus began to shift. Pyrrhus's military successes, particularly his victory over the Romans at Heraclea in 280 BC, earned him considerable fame and strengthened his position. But this victory came at a steep price, and Lanassa began to see the cracks forming in the foundation of his rule. Despite the outward appearances of success, Pyrrhus's victories were costly, and the toll on the kingdom's resources and soldiers was mounting. The costs of these campaigns were beginning to outweigh the benefits, and Lanassa was the one left to manage the fallout. In the wake of Pyrrhus's victory at Heraclea, the queen consort found herself increasingly involved in the governance of the kingdom. As Pyrrhus prepared for his next move, Lanassa worked tirelessly to maintain the stability of the realm. She dealt with the nobles who grew restless with the constant warfare and managed the kingdom's finances, ensuring that Pyrrhus's ambitions did not bankrupt Epirus. Yet, despite her efforts, she could not ignore the mounting tension between her personal feelings and the political realities of her marriage. The more Lanassa witnessed Pyrrhus's insatiable drive for conquest, the more she questioned whether the costs of his ambition were worth the price. She had entered the marriage with a sense of duty to both her family and her new kingdom, but the years of war and sacrifice were beginning to take their toll. Her growing disillusionment with her husband's single-minded focus on military glory mirrored the frustrations of the people of Epirus, who were weary of endless conflict. As Pyrrhus continued his military campaigns, Lanassa's role within the court grew ever more significant. She was not just a queen consort, but a key player in the political machinations of the kingdom. In her husband's absence, she had become the guardian of Epirus' stability, and her influence extended far beyond the palace walls. However, as the weight of her responsibilities grew, so did her sense of isolation. Her marriage, once a symbol of political unity, had become a distant partnership. Strained by the unrelenting pressures of war and power, it was clear to Lanassa that the political landscape of Epirus was changing, and with it, the role she played in her husband's ambitions. Her growing disillusionment would soon set the stage for the choices she would have to make, choices that would ultimately lead her down a path of political maneuvering and personal sacrifice. Her marriage to Pyrrhus was not just a political alliance, but the crucible in which her own legacy would be forged. Whether she could navigate the complexities of power, love, and loyalty remained to be seen. The transition from the familiar, sunlit shores of Syracuse to the rugged, mountainous landscape of Epirus was not one that Lanassa had taken lightly. The change in environment was jarring, and the customs of her new home were foreign to her. In Syracuse, she had been raised among the political intrigues of a bustling city-state, where every decision was tied to the delicate balance of power. But in Epirus, the focus was on military strength and expansion. Pyrrhus's ambitions dominated every aspect of life. First, the grandeur of the royal court in Epirus seemed like a strange new world. The people of Epirus, though loyal, had a different way of life. They were warriors accustomed to hardship and battle, with an intense focus on the defense of their realm. Pyrrhus himself, despite his charm and brilliance as a military leader, was a man driven by ambition, and the court reflected that. It was a world in which power was measured in victories on the battlefield and the ability to expand one's territory, not in political alliances or careful diplomacy. As queen consort, Lanassa was expected to support her husband's military efforts and assist in governing the kingdom. Yet, she quickly realized that her role was not merely ornamental. Unlike many other queens of the time, who were confined to the domestic sphere, Lanassa's role in the kingdom's governance was pivotal. With Pyrrhus frequently away, leading campaigns in distant lands, she became the de facto ruler in his absence, managing the kingdom's affairs and its delicate alliances with neighboring states. Her political acumen, honed from her upbringing in the turbulent court of Syracuse, quickly became evident. Lanassa proved to be a skilled diplomat, capable of maintaining the fragile alliances that Pyrrhus had forged. She worked tirelessly to keep the kingdom stable, managing relations with the surrounding Greek states, and securing critical trade routes to ensure the kingdom's survival. Epirus was strategically located between Greece and the western Mediterranean, making it an important player in the broader geopolitical landscape. The alliances Lanassa cultivated ensured that the kingdom's borders remained secure even as Pyrrhus's military campaigns stretched further and further into enemy territory. However, the growing tensions in Epirus were not limited to external threats. Inside the kingdom, the constant warfare was beginning to take its toll. The people of Epirus, though fiercely loyal to Pyrrhus, were weary of the endless fighting. The cost of his ambitions had begun to bleed into the very fabric of the kingdom. The once thriving economy was faltering, resources were stretched thin, and the casualties of war were mounting. Pyrrhus's obsession with military conquest had left little room for the day-to-day governance that ensured the prosperity of the kingdom. Lanassa, ever pragmatic, began to recognize that the stability of Epirus could not be maintained solely through military might. She understood that the kingdom's long-term survival depended on more than just victories in battle. It required careful management of the people and their needs. She worked tirelessly to address these concerns, negotiating peace treaties with neighboring states and managing the kingdom's internal affairs. But the strain of managing a war-torn kingdom was heavy, and Lanassa began to feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. While Pyrrhus was off in Italy, fighting the Romans and building his reputation as a great general, Lanassa was left behind to hold the fort. She was not just a figurehead, but the pillar that kept the kingdom from falling into chaos. In her husband's absence, she found herself making difficult decisions that would affect not just the immediate future of Epirus but its long-term survival. She often found herself at odds with some of the more militant factions of the court, who were eager for further conquest. But she understood that the kingdom's stability required a delicate balance between military ambition and internal governance. Over time, Lanassa's role as queen consort evolved. She began to exert more influence over the decisions made in the kingdom. Her political strategy focused on maintaining peace at home while Pyrrhus was away fighting the Romans. She took steps to consolidate power within the court, slowly strengthening her position. This was not without resistance, as many within the court saw her increasing influence as a threat to the traditional power structures of the kingdom. Some nobles and military leaders resented her growing authority, but Lanassa's political maneuvering kept them at bay. She navigated the court's intrigues with skill, using both diplomacy and pragmatism to neutralize threats. In the absence of her husband, Lanassa had to become more than just a queen. She became the face of Epirus, managing both its political and military affairs. Her ability to handle crises with grace and intellect earned her the respect of her subjects, though she was always careful to maintain a degree of humility. She was well aware of the delicate balance she had to maintain. While Pyrrhus was the king, she had become the kingdom's guardian in his absence. However, the personal cost of her role was immense. Lanassa had always been politically astute, but the pressure of managing a kingdom at war weighed heavily on her. As Pyrrhus's campaigns continued, she began to feel more and more isolated. She was a queen consort who had inherited a kingdom in crisis, and she was doing everything in her power to keep it afloat. Yet, despite her successes in governance, the emotional toll of the constant strain was beginning to show. Pyrrhus's absence from the court allowed Lanassa to forge her own path, but it also made her more aware of the distance growing between them. Their marriage, once a union of political necessity, had shifted over the years. Lanassa began to realize that the sacrifices she had made for the sake of the kingdom were not just political, they were personal. As Pyrrhus's focus shifted more and more toward his military conquests, Lanassa felt increasingly abandoned. The queen consort had become a figure of political importance, but she was also a woman whose own desires and needs were being neglected. Despite the growing emotional distance, Lanassa remained steadfast in her dedication to Epirus. she did not let her personal frustrations cloud her judgment. In the face of mounting pressures, she continued to work tirelessly for the betterment of the kingdom. She knew that the survival of Epirus depended on her ability to balance both the demands of power and the delicate art of diplomacy. But as Pyrrhus's campaigns dragged on, the burden of leadership became heavier. Lanassa began to question the price of her dedication. The alliances she had worked so hard to build were now under strain, and the cost of maintaining a kingdom at war was beginning to take its toll on her, both personally and politically. She found herself standing at a crossroads, torn between her duty to her husband and her kingdom, and her growing realization that the future of Epirus might require sacrifices she was no longer willing to make. Her political strategy, her influence over the court, and her ability to stabilize the kingdom in Pyrrhus's absence had made her an essential figure in the kingdom's survival. But as the years wore on, Lanassa found herself contemplating a difficult decision. Could she continue to support Pyrrhus's quest for glory, or would she have to make a bold choice that could change the course of her life and the future of Epirus forever? As the winds of war swept across the Mediterranean, the distant thunder of Roman legions echoed louder with each passing day. For Pyrrhus of Epirus, the growing power of Rome was both a challenge and an opportunity. His ambition to carve out an empire for Epirus could not be realized without confronting the looming threat that the Romans represented. But for Lanassa, it was not just the distant armies of Rome that posed a challenge. It was the toll that Pyrrhus's unrelenting focus on conquest was taking on their marriage, the stability of Epirus, and her own sense of self. Pyrrhus's decision to challenge Rome was not made lightly. The rising power of the Roman Republic had already begun to stretch its influence across the Italian peninsula, and the Romans had already shown their might in their wars against the Greek colonies in southern Italy. For Pyrrhus, this was a clear indication that his own dreams of expanding Epirus' influence into Italy could not be achieved without first taking on Rome. His victory over the Romans at Heraclea in 280 BC would become the first of many clashes, each one pushing him further into the quagmire of endless military campaigns. Lanassa, though never an expert in military tactics, was a keen observer of the political currents that shaped the actions of her husband. In the early days of Pyrrhus's campaign, she played a vital role in the background, ensuring the stability of Epirus and managing the affairs of the court in his absence. Though the queen had not been directly involved in the strategy or execution of battles, she knew that the stakes of Pyrrhus's war efforts were higher than ever. Her kingdom's future, and by extension her own, hung in the balance. The Battle of Heraclea was a victory for Pyrrhus, a triumph of military brilliance. Yet, despite the outward success, the price of this victory was far steeper than anyone had anticipated. The Romans, though defeated, had fought fiercely, and Pyrrhus's army had suffered significant losses. The term Pyrrhic victory would soon become synonymous with his name, a victory that left the victor weakened and unable to capitalize on his success. This was the bitter reality of war, one that Lanassa would soon come to understand all too well. As the news of Heraclea reached the court of Epirus, Lanassa's role became more important than ever. The victory had earned Pyrrhus renown, but it had also left his forces depleted. The people of Epirus, once filled with pride at their king's successes, now began to feel the weight of the prolonged conflict. Pyrrhus's promise of a new, grand empire was beginning to feel distant as the realities of warfare began to hit home. The kingdom's resources were stretched thin, and the people grew weary of the endless cycle of battles. For Lanassa, this was a time of great personal and political strain. Her position as queen consort had once been filled with a sense of purpose and opportunity to shape the future of her kingdom. But now, as Pyrrhus's wars dragged on, her role seemed increasingly defined by the need to manage the fallout of his military decisions. She worked tirelessly to maintain order within the court and ensure that Epirus remained stable despite the pressures from within and the looming threats from Rome. Pyrrhus's next move came swiftly after Heraclea. Determined to press on, he set his sights on the southern part of Italy, seeking to extend his influence further into the region. This time, however, the Roman response was much more coordinated, and their armies were more prepared. The Battle of Asculum in 279 BC would prove to be another costly engagement for Pyrrhus, one that would leave him victorious but at a devastating cost. The outcome was a victory for Pyrrhus's forces, but his army was severely depleted. The Romans, though suffering losses, were able to replenish their ranks far quicker than Pyrrhus could, and this disparity in resources would prove crucial in the following years. As the wars continued, Lanassa began to feel the deepening isolation that came with her husband's singular focus on war. Though she had played an active role in managing the kingdom, her ability to influence Pyrrhus's military strategy was limited. She knew that the stakes were high, and that every decision Pyrrhus made could either secure their future or destroy everything they had fought for. Yet, as the years went by, the victories that Pyrrhus celebrated felt increasingly hollow to Lanassa. Each victory was followed by mounting casualties, a depletion of resources, and a growing dissatisfaction among the people of Epirus. In the midst of these challenges, Lanassa found herself questioning whether Pyrrhus's pursuit of glory was worth the cost. While Pyrrhus had always dreamed of creating an empire that would rival Rome, Lanassa began to realize that his dreams were not necessarily in alignment with the needs of their kingdom. The incessant wars were draining the kingdom of its vitality, and the once proud people of Epirus were beginning to question the wisdom of Pyrrhus's military ambitions. Lanassa's internal struggle mirrored that of the people of Epirus. The queen consort, once full of hope and conviction, was now weighed down by the knowledge that her husband's quest for greatness was pushing their kingdom to the brink. She had long been a loyal wife, supporting Pyrrhus in his ambitions, but the toll of constant war had begun to erode her faith in his leadership. She wondered whether the price of victory paid in blood, resources, and the suffering of her people was worth the fleeting glory of military conquest. Despite her growing disillusionment, Lanassa remained steadfast in her duty. She knew that the fate of Epirus was intertwined with Pyrrhus's success or failure, and she could not abandon her kingdom in its time of need. She continued to work tirelessly behind the scenes, forging alliances, managing the kingdom's resources, and maintaining stability in Pyrrhus's absence. Yet, she could not ignore the growing distance between herself and her husband, a distance that had been created not only by the pressures of war but by the changing nature of their relationship. The Battle of Asculum, though a victory, marked a turning point for both Pyrrhus and Lanassa. Pyrrhus's hopes of creating an empire were slowly being chipped away by the realities of warfare, and Lanassa, once a passive observer of his ambitions, was now an active participant in the political and emotional consequences of his decisions. As the years wore on, she found herself caught between the loyalty to her husband, the love she once had for him, and the growing realization that her future and the future of Epirus may require a different path altogether. Pyrrhus's next move would be critical, and Lanassa's role in shaping the kingdom's future would soon come into sharper focus. The costs of war were becoming too great to ignore, and the decisions made in the coming months would determine whether Epirus could survive the turbulence or whether it would crumble under the weight of its own ambitions. As the years wore on, the political landscape of Epirus became increasingly difficult to navigate, and Lanassa found herself once again drawn to her homeland. Though she had been raised in the court of Syracuse, it was only after years of living in the rugged, militaristic environment of Epirus that she truly began to understand the importance of her homeland in the larger political scheme of the Mediterranean. While Pyrrhus's military ambitions consumed his attention, Lanassa's thoughts began to turn more frequently toward Syracuse, where her father's legacy still loomed large, and where the future of her own family and the future of Epirus was beginning to take shape. Syracuse, despite its challenges, had always been a city-state with a rich history and a powerful political network. The city had faced numerous threats over the years, from the Carthaginians to the growing influence of Rome, yet it had always managed to persevere. In Lanassa's mind, the lessons of her father's reign, the political maneuvering, the alliances, and the careful diplomacy, had prepared her to step back into the political world of Syracuse with a deft hand. While Pyrrhus's conquests had left her politically isolated in Epirus, her connection to Syracuse, through both her bloodline and her early experiences, remained a critical aspect of her identity. In the years following Pyrrhus's campaigns, Syracuse found itself in a precarious position. The city-state was surrounded by growing threats, both from Rome's expanding reach and from internal dissent. Although Syracuse had long been a powerful force in the Mediterranean, the pressure from these external and internal challenges had taken its toll. Lanassa, always politically astute, recognized that the situation in Syracuse was deteriorating and her re-engagement with the city was inevitable. Despite her role as queen consort in Epirus, Lanassa never fully severed her ties with Syracuse. She maintained contact with influential figures in the city, particularly with those who had supported her father's reign. She was well aware that the people of Syracuse, despite their loyalty to her father, were wary of Pyrrhus's growing influence in the region. Pyrrhus's military expansionism had placed the city-state of Syracuse in an increasingly difficult position, and as the political tensions mounted, Lanassa knew that her intervention would be needed to prevent a potential collapse of the city's power. In the absence of Pyrrhus, who remained focused on his distant conquests, Lanassa began to use her influence to engage in the political machinations of her homeland. She had always been an astute observer of the power plays within the courts of both Epirus and Syracuse, but now she was thrust into the role of a mediator, balancing the interests of both the city-state and the Epirote kingdom. Her unique position allowed her to speak to both sides, leveraging her connection to Syracuse to strengthen Epirus' alliances, even as tensions with Rome and other Greek states intensified. While Pyrrhus fought on the front lines, Lanassa worked behind the scenes, managing the delicate balance of power between Syracuse and Epirus. She worked tirelessly to prevent the rise of dissent within Syracuse and to maintain the tenuous peace between the various factions within the city-state. The task was not an easy one. Internal strife was a constant threat, as rival factions jockeyed for power and influence. Lanassa's influence at the court of Syracuse became critical as she navigated these rivalries, using her diplomatic skills to keep potential rebels in check and ensure that the interests of her family and, by extension, Pyrrhus were protected. But it was not just the internal politics of Syracuse that Lanassa had to contend with. The growing power of Rome posed a serious threat to both Epirus and Syracuse. As the Romans extended their control over the Italian peninsula, they began to exert pressure on the Greek city-states, including Syracuse, which had long held a position of relative independence. Lanassa understood that Rome's ambitions could not be ignored, and she began to subtly shift Syracuse's diplomatic strategies to accommodate this new reality. While her father had been able to maintain a delicate balance between the various powers of the Mediterranean, Lanassa's task was far more complicated. Rome was no longer a distant threat. It was a rising power, one that had already shown its willingness to crush any resistance in its path. The situation in Syracuse was increasingly dire. As tensions with Rome escalated, the internal political scene in Syracuse became even more volatile. Lanassa, recognizing the need for swift action, worked behind the scenes to forge new alliances with other Greek states and to strengthen Syracuse's defenses. She played the role of peacemaker, working to convince both the Carthaginians and the Romans that Syracuse would not be an easy target. She knew that Syracuse's survival depended on its ability to play both sides against each other, ensuring that neither Rome nor Carthage could claim dominance. As Lanassa became more entrenched in the politics of Syracuse, her own personal struggles with Pyrrhus continued to evolve. The growing distance between them was becoming more apparent, not just in their personal relationship but in the way they conducted their political affairs. Pyrrhus, so absorbed in his military ambitions, had increasingly relied on Lanassa to manage the affairs of Epirus and their broader political interests. While his attention was focused on Rome, Lanassa found herself at the forefront of their diplomatic endeavors. Yet despite her growing influence and success in managing the complex political realities of Syracuse, Lanassa could not escape the feeling of being caught between two worlds. Her duty to Epirus and her loyalty to Pyrrhus were constantly at odds with her desire to preserve Syracuse's independence and safeguard her family's legacy. As she navigated the choppy waters of Mediterranean politics, she began to wonder whether the sacrifices she had made for the sake of Epirus and Syracuse were truly worth the cost. It was clear to Lanassa that her future, and that of Syracuse, would require decisive action. The time had come for her to make a difficult choice. Should she continue to fight for the survival of both Epirus and Syracuse, or should she make a bold decision that would change the course of her life and the future of the Mediterranean? Her decision was not an easy one. Lanassa knew that her actions would have far-reaching consequences, not only for her family and her marriage to Pyrrhus but also for the broader political balance of the Mediterranean. She was at a crossroads, and the choices she made in the coming months would determine her legacy and the future of the lands she held dear. The year 280 BC marked a turning point in the history of Epirus, as Pyrrhus of Epirus, the ambitious and brilliant young king, engaged the Roman legions in one of the most significant battles of his career. The Battle of Heraclea was to become a milestone in Pyrrhus's campaign to challenge Rome's growing influence in the Mediterranean. But it would also come to symbolize the cost of his relentless pursuit of glory. Lanassa had watched from the sidelines as her husband prepared for the battle, a mix of pride and apprehension in her heart. The future of Epirus hinged on the outcome of this confrontation. The stakes could not have been higher. The Romans, despite their young republic, had already shown their military prowess by defeating several of their neighbors. Now, they were marching towards the Greek world, and Pyrrhus was determined to stop them. His military brilliance was well known, but as the battle drew near, Lanassa began to understand the true cost of his ambition. Before the battle, Lanassa had been deeply involved in managing the kingdom's affairs. Her husband's absence meant that the responsibility of governance fell largely on her shoulders. She continued to balance the needs of the court and maintain Epirus' fragile alliances, but there was a growing unease in the kingdom. Whispers of the upcoming battle and its potential consequences filled the air. Would Pyrrhus's brilliance be enough to secure victory, or would the might of Rome prove too great to overcome? The battle took place at Heraclea, located on the southern coast of Italy, and Pyrrhus faced the Roman legions under the command of the consuls. It was a battle between two contrasting forces: Pyrrhus's experienced mercenary army, bolstered by Greek hoplites, and the disciplined, efficient Roman legions. For Pyrrhus, the battle was both a test of his strategic genius and a demonstration of his will to carve out an empire for Epirus. Pyrrhus's strategy was bold and innovative. He used his cavalry, some of the finest in the Greek world, to flank the Roman legions, while his infantry engaged head-on. The battle was fierce, and the casualties on both sides were devastating. Despite the ferocity of the Roman forces, Pyrrhus's army managed to gain the upper hand. His use of elephants, though unconventional, proved to be a decisive factor, striking terror into the Roman ranks. After hours of fighting, the Romans were forced to retreat and Pyrrhus emerged victorious. The news of the victory reached Epirus soon after. For Lanassa, the initial feeling was one of triumph. Her husband had achieved what many had thought impossible, a victory against the mighty Roman legions. The celebrations in the court of Epirus were overwhelming, with soldiers, nobles, and citizens alike hailing Pyrrhus as the greatest military commander of the age. Lanassa, too, felt a sense of pride in her husband's success. It was a moment that solidified Pyrrhus's status as a military genius and a leader who could challenge Rome itself. Yet, beneath the surface of the celebrations, there was a growing tension. Pyrrhus's victory at Heraclea, though significant, came at a great cost. His army had suffered heavy casualties. Estimates suggested that nearly half of his forces were either killed or wounded in the battle. This was a stark reminder of the toll that constant warfare took on his kingdom and his people. The victory, while celebrated, had left Pyrrhus's forces severely weakened, and the prospect of further campaigns began to weigh heavily on both him and Lanassa. Back in Epirus, Lanassa found herself dealing with the aftermath of the battle. Pyrrhus had returned to his capital, but the true effects of the battle were evident. While the victory had brought prestige, it had also depleted the kingdom's resources and manpower. The costs of the war were mounting, and Lanassa was now faced with the challenge of managing the kingdom during a time of both political uncertainty and military exhaustion. The people of Epirus were proud of their king, but they were also weary of the prolonged conflict. Lanassa's role in the aftermath of the battle became even more significant, with Pyrrhus focused on his next move against Rome and his ambition to expand his influence further into Italy. The queen consort took it upon herself to ensure that the kingdom did not crumble under the weight of war. She began to meet with advisors, nobles, and military leaders to assess the kingdom's resources and determine the best course of action moving forward. Her political instincts, honed during her time in Syracuse, were invaluable in this moment. As the wounds from Heraclea began to heal, Lanassa faced a growing realization. Pyrrhus's victory had come at a price that might soon become unbearable. The losses, though tactical victories, had drained Epirus of its fighting spirit. The kingdom could not sustain such a continuous campaign. The victory, once a source of immense pride, began to feel hollow. Pyrrhus, with his unyielding ambition, seemed more determined than ever to continue his march toward glory, but Lanassa knew that this path would only lead to further destruction. In the quiet moments following the celebrations, Lanassa began to question whether her husband's vision for Epirus was truly in the best interest of the kingdom. Pyrrhus had long believed that Rome could be defeated, but the reality of war was more complicated than mere military genius. Pyrrhus's victory at Heraclea had proven that he could defeat Rome in battle, but it also exposed the cracks in his strategy. The Romans, though defeated, were far from broken, and the war they had waged was one of attrition. The cost of victory would continue to climb with every battle. As Lanassa reflected on the cost of war, she knew that the time was coming when she would have to make a decision that would reshape the future of Epirus. Pyrrhus's dreams of empire were noble, but they were also dangerous. The kingdom, though victorious at Heraclea, was on the brink of exhaustion. The people, though proud of their king, were beginning to question whether Pyrrhus's quest for glory was worth the suffering it brought to their homes and families. Lanassa's political acumen and understanding of the delicate balance between power and diplomacy would soon be tested to the fullest. The victory at Heraclea, though a testament to Pyrrhus's military genius, was also the beginning of a far more complex struggle, one that would require Lanassa to navigate the labyrinth of power, both within her kingdom and on the world stage. The time had come for the queen consort to decide whether to continue supporting her husband's ambitions or to chart a new course for herself and Epirus. The aftermath of the Battle of Heraclea should have been a time of consolidation and reflection for Epirus. Instead, the euphoria of victory soon began to fade, replaced by the harsh reality of the kingdom's situation. Pyrrhus's military genius had brought him success on the battlefield, but it had come at a significant price. His army was severely weakened. Resources were stretched thin, and the toll on the people of Epirus was beginning to show. The kingdom, despite its victory, was on the brink of exhaustion. For Lanassa, this period of time was marked by an ever-deepening sense of frustration and disillusionment. Her marriage to Pyrrhus, once a union of political necessity, had grown increasingly distant. The early days of their partnership had been filled with the promise of mutual ambition, with the goal of securing a legacy for Epirus. But as Pyrrhus became more obsessed with military conquest, Lanassa found herself increasingly sidelined. She had become not only a queen consort but a caretaker, managing the kingdom in his absence, dealing with the growing discontent of the people, and struggling to hold the court together. Her role in Epirus had evolved dramatically since their marriage. Lanassa had once been a partner to Pyrrhus in governance, her influence crucial in maintaining the kingdom's stability. But now, as Pyrrhus continued his military campaigns, her power and influence seemed increasingly constrained. She was relegated to managing the day-to-day affairs of a kingdom at war, with no say in the larger strategic decisions that Pyrrhus made. The love and respect she had once felt for him began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of resentment. The tension between them, which had begun to brew after the Battle of Heraclea, only worsened in the months that followed. Pyrrhus, though grateful for her stewardship of Epirus in his absence, seemed increasingly absorbed by his own dreams of empire. His focus on military glory became all-consuming, and Lanassa began to feel that her contributions to the kingdom, her diplomatic efforts, her role in managing the court, and her efforts to maintain stability were being undervalued. In many ways, she had become nothing more than a figurehead in Pyrrhus's grand design, her worth defined by her ability to maintain the kingdom while he pursued his personal ambitions. But as the weeks turned to months, the growing discontent among the people of Epirus began to mirror Lanassa's own frustrations. The toll of war had begun to take its toll not only on the army but on the kingdom's economy, morale, and political structure. The nobles and military leaders who had once rallied around Pyrrhus's vision of expansion were now questioning the wisdom of his relentless campaigns. The kingdom, once filled with pride in its military successes, was beginning to show signs of wear and tear. The economic strain was palpable, and the people of Epirus, once supportive of their king, were starting to grow weary of the constant conflict. Lanassa, who had always been a pragmatist, understood that her loyalty to Pyrrhus was not blind. She loved him, but she was beginning to recognize the dangers of his single-minded pursuit of empire. Pyrrhus's victories had come at such a cost that Lanassa could no longer ignore the toll they were taking on both the kingdom and their relationship. The queen consort found herself at a crossroads, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her growing sense of responsibility to the kingdom she had worked so hard to stabilize. As Pyrrhus continued his campaigns against Rome and the Greek states, Lanassa's frustration only grew. The queen consort, once a key player in the political landscape of Epirus, now found herself isolated in a court that was increasingly dominated by military figures. The political intrigue that once filled the halls of the palace had been replaced by discussions of battles, tactics, and the endless pursuit of military glory. The very foundations of the kingdom were being strained, and Lanassa realized that it could not survive on military conquests alone. In the privacy of her chambers, Lanassa often found herself contemplating her future. She knew that she could no longer continue to support Pyrrhus's quest for empire without question. The cost of his ambitions had already been too high, and the toll it had taken on their marriage was irreparable. While she had once stood by his side, confident that his leadership would lead to greatness for both him and the kingdom, she now saw that his obsession with conquest was pushing Epirus into a state of exhaustion. She could no longer reconcile the man she had married, the man with whom she had once shared a dream of building a lasting empire, with the leader he had become. The man who had once been her partner, a king with whom she had hoped to build a dynasty, was now a man consumed by the pursuit of personal glory. Lanassa, ever the political strategist, knew that the survival of Epirus required a shift in direction. The kingdom needed stability, not constant warfare. But the path to stability was one that Pyrrhus was unwilling to take. As Lanassa struggled with her internal conflict, the political landscape of Epirus continued to shift. The nobles, who had once supported Pyrrhus's ambitions, began to question the wisdom of his decisions. The people, weary of war and its costs, began to grow restless. Even those who had once been loyal to the king began to whisper among themselves that perhaps it was time for Epirus to seek a different path. Lanassa found herself in a difficult position, caught between her duty to her husband, her loyalty to her kingdom, and her own growing sense of disillusionment. She could no longer ignore the cracks in the foundation of Pyrrhus's rule. The kingdom she had worked so hard to protect was now at a crossroads, and the decisions she made in the coming months would have lasting consequences for both Epirus and her own future. The queen consort's growing discontent was not just a personal struggle, it was a reflection of the broader political reality facing Epirus. The kingdom, though once a powerful force in the Mediterranean, was beginning to fray at the edges. The relentless pursuit of military glory had taken its toll on both Pyrrhus's army and the people of Epirus. The question now was whether the kingdom could survive the toll of these endless campaigns or whether it would collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. Lanassa's role in the future of Epirus was no longer clear. The choices she faced were not easy, and the path ahead was uncertain. But one thing was becoming increasingly evident: if Epirus was to survive, it would require more than just military victories. It would require a shift in leadership, a new vision for the future, and a recognition that the kingdom's survival depended on more than just conquest. The year 279 BC brought another pivotal chapter in the saga of Pyrrhus's war with Rome. Following his costly victory at Heraclea, Pyrrhus's ambitions remained undiminished. But the effects of the battle were starting to take a toll, not just on his military strength, but on the very fabric of his kingdom. The people of Epirus, though loyal, began to feel the strain of the endless campaigns, and their patience was running thin. Yet, for Pyrrhus, there was no turning back. The desire to carve out an empire in Italy, to stand toe-to-toe with the rising power of Rome, consumed him. Lanassa, ever the keen observer, had watched Pyrrhus's resolve harden with each passing day. After Heraclea, she had hoped for a moment of respite, a chance to consolidate power and strengthen the kingdom. Instead, Pyrrhus's eyes remained firmly fixed on the horizon, determined to press on despite the mounting losses. She had tried time and time again to appeal to him, urging him to reconsider the cost of his conquests. But Pyrrhus, his mind set on glory, seemed blind to the toll that his ambitions were taking, not only on his army but on his own people, including Lanassa herself. The Battle of Asculum, fought in 279 BC, became the next testing ground for Pyrrhus's military genius. The Romans, though beaten at Heraclea, had regrouped and were now better prepared for Pyrrhus's tactics. The battle that ensued was brutal. As with his previous engagement, Pyrrhus deployed his elephants and cavalry with great skill, but this time the Roman forces, led by the consuls, had adapted. The legions, more disciplined and organized than ever, met Pyrrhus's forces head-on with an intensity that made the previous Roman retreat at Heraclea seem like a distant memory. Despite Pyrrhus's brilliant use of tactics and his heavy reliance on his cavalry, the battle was not the decisive victory he had hoped for. The clash was fierce, and as the hours dragged on, the casualties mounted. Pyrrhus, ever determined, managed to maintain his grip on the field, but the cost was steep. The victory was Pyrrhus's, at least on paper, but it was a victory that came at a much higher price than he had anticipated. The loss of his elite soldiers, the depletion of resources, and the exhaustion of his army left him in a precarious position. News of the battle reached Epirus not long after, and Lanassa, who had been overseeing the affairs of the kingdom in Pyrrhus's absence, was flooded with mixed emotions. A sense of pride in her husband's ability to secure another victory was tempered by the grim realization that the price of this battle had been even higher than Heraclea. She knew that this victory, like the one before, was a Pyrrhic victory, a hollow achievement that left the victor too damaged to capitalize on their success. As Pyrrhus returned to Epirus after the battle, the weight of the campaign was visible on him. The fatigue was evident in his face, his once proud posture now slumped from the physical and emotional toll of the endless warfare. He had won again. But what had he truly gained? Pyrrhus was surrounded by the remains of a battered army, and in the eyes of the people, the glory of his victories was beginning to fade into the shadow of the growing suffering. Lanassa's role during this time became ever more pivotal. As the queen consort, she was not only the caretaker of the kingdom's internal affairs but the emotional and political anchor of the court. She had long been managing the fallout of Pyrrhus's military campaigns. But this time, the task before her seemed insurmountable. The strain of war had now affected more than just the resources of Epirus. It had touched the heart of the kingdom, its people, and its leadership. Lanassa, though often overshadowed by her husband's larger-than-life presence, now found herself in a position where her decisions would determine the future of Epirus. With Pyrrhus physically and emotionally drained, Lanassa took on even more responsibility in the kingdom. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the kingdom did not fall into chaos in the aftermath of the battle. Managing the growing unrest among the people and dealing with the nobles who were beginning to question the wisdom of Pyrrhus's military endeavors. Despite her growing influence, Lanassa knew that the path her husband had chosen could not be sustained. As the queen consort, she had always understood the delicate balance of power, and now she was painfully aware that Epirus was teetering on the edge of collapse. The resources of the kingdom were drained, the military exhausted, and the people growing resentful of the endless wars. But her attempts to convey her concerns to Pyrrhus fell on deaf ears. He remained resolute in his belief that only by defeating Rome could Epirus secure its future. Lanassa's frustration reached a breaking point. She could no longer ignore the disparity between her desires for peace and stability and Pyrrhus's obsession with war and conquest. The once great partnership they had shared was now riddled with tension. As she struggled to maintain the political stability of the kingdom, Lanassa began to question her place in Pyrrhus's vision. Had she become nothing more than a caretaker for a kingdom that was destined to crumble under the weight of its own military ambitions? In the quiet moments of reflection, Lanassa was forced to confront the painful truth. Pyrrhus's victories, while impressive, were not enough to guarantee the survival of Epirus. The kingdom's future was at risk, not from external enemies, but from the internal devastation caused by years of endless warfare. Lanassa knew that she could not continue to support a path that was leading Epirus down a path of ruin. But confronting her husband's ambitions would require more than just words. It would take decisive action. Her decision, though still distant, was becoming clearer with each passing day. She knew that if she were to save Epirus, she would need to act both in her own personal life and on the political stage. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Pyrrhus's dreams of empire had reached their breaking point. The time had come for Lanassa to step forward to make a decision that would determine not just her own future, but the future of Epirus itself. As the years passed, the gulf between Lanassa and Pyrrhus grew wider, and the weight of the kingdom's struggles began to take a personal toll. The victories Pyrrhus had once celebrated now felt like hollow victories, the price of which had far exceeded any gains. Lanassa, ever the pragmatic queen consort, could no longer deny the growing fissures in her marriage and in her heart. The political landscape of Epirus had become increasingly unstable, and the pressure of managing the kingdom, both internally and externally, had fallen almost entirely on her shoulders. The constant strain of war had not only depleted Epirus' resources but had also eroded the emotional connection she once shared with her husband. In the early years of their marriage, Lanassa had believed in Pyrrhus's vision of an empire, one that would be built on military conquest and glory. She had supported him through the battles, the losses, and the sacrifices. But now, as Epirus teetered on the edge of collapse, Lanassa could no longer bring herself to ignore the reality that Pyrrhus's ambitions were no longer in line with the kingdom's needs. Her growing discontent was not merely political, it was deeply personal. She had always been a partner to Pyrrhus, balancing his military ambitions with the practicalities of governance. But over time, his relentless focus on warfare had left her feeling increasingly isolated, both in her marriage and in her role as queen. She had once believed that her dedication to him and to the kingdom would lead to prosperity, but now she saw that Pyrrhus's obsession with glory was eroding both. Pyrrhus, too, had changed over the years. His dreams of building an empire were no longer about the future of Epirus. They were about his own legacy, his place in history. The man who had once been her partner in both politics and marriage was now a distant figure, consumed by his own pursuits. He was no longer the ruler she had once supported. He was a man blind to the realities of his kingdom, and Lanassa could not continue to stand by him, watching the kingdom fall apart while he pursued an ever-elusive dream of grandeur. The decision to divorce was not made lightly. Lanassa knew that it would shake the very foundations of both Epirus and her own life. Divorce in the ancient world, especially among royalty, was not a simple affair. It carried with it immense political and social ramifications. It would not only sever her personal connection to Pyrrhus but could also destabilize the already fragile alliances between the Greek states. Yet, despite these risks, Lanassa felt that it was the only way forward. She could not continue to sacrifice her own well-being, nor could she ignore the damage Pyrrhus was inflicting upon the kingdom. In a quiet, tense council with Pyrrhus, Lanassa presented her case. She did not do so with anger, nor with malice. She simply laid out the reality that they both knew, but had been avoiding. The toll of endless war, the depletion of the kingdom's resources, and the personal isolation she felt in their marriage had become unbearable. Pyrrhus, in his usual manner, was not moved by emotion, but by his own sense of duty to his military ambitions. He did not understand Lanassa's decision to walk away from their marriage, to leave the kingdom she had once helped him build. Yet, as Lanassa explained the dire straits of Epirus, her words began to sink in. Though Pyrrhus did not accept the divorce readily, he understood the logic of her reasoning. He knew that Lanassa had done her best to support him, and he could not deny the fact that the war had taken more than just soldiers. It had taken their connection, their bond, and their shared vision for the future. Still, the thought of losing his queen, his partner in governance, was a blow that Pyrrhus had not anticipated. He had long been accustomed to the idea of battle, of conquest, but the loss of Lanassa was a different kind of defeat. Yet, for all his ambition and military prowess, Pyrrhus had no answer to the situation at hand. The empire he sought to build had no room for the personal toll it exacted on those closest to him. With the decision made, Lanassa prepared for the next phase of her life. Her return to Syracuse, her homeland, was both a physical and symbolic journey. She had once been the princess of Syracuse, daughter of Agathocles, the man who had seized power and established a legacy of his own. Now, she was returning not as a princess, but as a queen who had seen the devastating cost of ambition, and who was determined to forge a new path for herself and the future of her people. Her departure from Epirus was met with mixed emotions. While the court respected her decision and acknowledged her leadership in the face of Pyrrhus's campaigns, there was an underlying sense of loss. Lanassa had been more than just a queen consort. She had been the stabilizing force that kept Epirus functioning during the most trying of times. Her absence would leave a void in the kingdom that would be difficult to fill. Upon her arrival in Syracuse, Lanassa was greeted with both admiration and skepticism. Her return to the city-state was an event of great political significance, and the people of Syracuse were eager to see how their former princess would navigate the challenges facing their homeland. The political landscape in Syracuse was fraught with its own struggles. Though the city had weathered many storms, it was once again at a crossroads. The growing power of Rome had begun to cast a shadow over the independence of the Greek city-states, and Syracuse was no exception. The Carthaginians, too, had their eyes on the city, and the local nobility was divided on how best to manage these external threats. Lanassa, ever the political strategist, quickly assessed the situation and set about re-establishing herself as a key player in the court of Syracuse. She knew that the survival of her city-state depended on carefully balancing its alliances, and she used her diplomatic skills to broker peace with Carthage while keeping Rome at bay. She worked tirelessly to restore the political stability that had been threatened by both internal divisions and external pressures. But even as she worked to rebuild the power of Syracuse, Lanassa could not escape the emotional weight of her decision to divorce Pyrrhus. She had hoped that her return to Syracuse would bring relief, but instead, she found herself questioning the sacrifices she had made both for Epirus and for her marriage. She had walked away from a kingdom in turmoil from a man she had once loved, in the hopes of finding peace. Yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, she wondered if peace was ever truly attainable for someone who had once been at the heart of two of the Mediterranean's most powerful kingdoms. Her decision to leave Pyrrhus and return to Syracuse had altered the course of her life. It had separated her from the man she had once believed in, but it had also given her the opportunity to chart her own destiny. As Lanassa looked out over the city of Syracuse, she knew that the future would not be without its challenges. But she also understood that she now had the chance to lead on her own terms. Her journey, however, was far from over. The political intrigue of Syracuse, the ever-looming threat of Rome, and the remnants of her past with Pyrrhus would continue to shape her future. But Lanassa, once a princess caught in the tides of political maneuvering, was now a queen in control of her own fate. Lanassa's return to Syracuse was met with a mixture of anticipation and wariness. She had left the city-state years ago, married to Pyrrhus of Epirus, and now she returned not as the princess she had once been, but as a queen consort of Epirus who had lived through both triumph and tragedy. Her decision to divorce Pyrrhus and leave the kingdom she had helped manage was seen as a bold one, and her return to Syracuse brought with it not just personal reflection, but an opportunity for political rebirth. The streets of Syracuse, though bustling with the usual activities of trade and political discourse, seemed to hum with a sense of unease at Lanassa's arrival. The city, though still powerful, was far from immune to the growing pressure from external forces. Rome, steadily expanding its influence, was casting an ever longer shadow over the Greek city-states. Syracuse's old rival, Carthage, also had its eyes on the city, ever eager to secure dominance in the western Mediterranean. The noble houses of Syracuse, too, were fracturing, with rival factions vying for power and influence in the wake of the struggles with the Carthaginians and Romans. As Lanassa entered the gates of Syracuse, it was clear to her that the political landscape had changed. The city that had once been the jewel of the Greek world was now a place in turmoil, struggling to find its place amid the shifting power dynamics. The challenges she faced would not be merely external. Rome, Carthage, and the growing discontent among the nobles would be difficult obstacles, but she would also have to contend with the fractured political factions within Syracuse itself. Her return was not just a political move, it was a statement. The people of Syracuse, long accustomed to the chaos of war and the shifting tides of politics, saw in Lanassa a figure who had been tested by fire. She had walked away from Pyrrhus's empire-building ambitions, from the riches and power that might have come with it, and had chosen the hard path of survival and leadership. There was no denying that she was a figure of great strength, and those who had been wary of her return soon began to see that her political skills were sharper than ever. Despite the respect she commanded, Lanassa knew that earning the trust of the people and the nobles of Syracuse would not be easy. She had to navigate the complex web of political allegiances and rivalries that had developed during her absence. The various factions within the city-state had their own agendas, and their leaders were not always quick to unite for the common good of Syracuse. But Lanassa was no stranger to political maneuvering. She had grown up in a court filled with intrigue and had spent years as a queen consort in a foreign land where her influence had been tested at the highest levels. Lanassa began her political campaign by re-establishing her relationships with the old allies of her family. She reached out to the influential families who had supported her father, Agathocles, and began forging new alliances with the rising powers within Syracuse. She was careful to avoid making any drastic moves too quickly, understanding that the balance of power in the city was fragile. Her strategy was one of patience and diplomacy. She spent time listening to the concerns of the people, meeting with the local nobility, and securing her position by making subtle but effective political gestures. One of the first issues Lanassa tackled was the city's defense. With Rome's growing presence in the western Mediterranean, Syracuse could not afford to be complacent. Lanassa sought to strengthen the city's military alliances not only with neighboring Greek states but with other Mediterranean powers such as Carthage. While she was careful not to alienate the Roman Republic completely, she understood that Syracuse's survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance between these two emerging superpowers. She also took steps to improve the internal situation in Syracuse, which was plagued by economic instability and a divided nobility. Under her guidance, the city began to focus on rebuilding its economy, strengthening trade routes, and stabilizing its infrastructure. She knew that without a thriving economy, Syracuse would be unable to resist the pressures from Rome and Carthage. But Lanassa also recognized that political unity was key to her success. She worked tirelessly to bridge the gaps between the various factions of Syracuse's elite, using her diplomatic skills to broker agreements that were in the city's best interests. Yet, her return was not without its complications. Lanassa had left Epirus, but the political repercussions of her divorce from Pyrrhus were still being felt. Her former husband's military campaigns had left the Mediterranean world in turmoil, and the consequences of his actions were still rippling across the region. Pyrrhus, having been consumed by his desire for empire, had not taken kindly to her departure. Though they had been married for years, their relationship had become increasingly strained, and her decision to leave him was one he would not easily forget. Lanassa was well aware that Pyrrhus would likely view her return to Syracuse as a betrayal. Their once close partnership had deteriorated over time, and the personal cost of her decision was something she had to bear alone. Her emotional connection to him had been severed long ago. But she knew that Pyrrhus would not take kindly to her re-establishment of power in the city that had once been his ally. Still, she was determined to move forward with the task at hand, securing Syracuse's future both politically and militarily. Lanassa's ability to balance the delicate demands of diplomacy with the political realities of the time soon became evident. While she worked hard to stabilize Syracuse internally, she also began to navigate the complex diplomatic landscape of the Mediterranean. Her skills as a mediator were invaluable as she sought to maintain peace with Carthage while ensuring that Syracuse did not fall under Rome's growing influence. She began to cultivate alliances with other Greek city-states and used her connections to bolster Syracuse's position as a respected power in the Mediterranean. As the months passed, Lanassa's leadership began to bear fruit. Syracuse, once on the brink of collapse, slowly began to regain its strength. The people who had once doubted her return now saw in her a leader who had both the vision and the resolve to guide them through the most difficult of times. She had turned the political tides in her favor, and Syracuse was beginning to see the benefits of her steady hand at the helm. But Lanassa knew that her journey was far from over. The challenges she faced were immense, and the path to securing Syracuse's future would be long and difficult. Rome's power was still growing, and the balance of power in the Mediterranean remained fragile. Yet, for the first time in many years, Lanassa felt a sense of purpose. She had returned to Syracuse not as the daughter of a tyrant, nor as the wife of a king, but as a ruler in her own right. Her power was not based on her marriage or her bloodline, but on her ability to lead and to navigate the complex and ever-changing political landscape. Syracuse, under her guidance, was on the verge of a new era, one that would require careful diplomacy, strong leadership, and a deep understanding of the fragile balance of power in the Mediterranean. But with Lanassa at the helm, there was hope that Syracuse could not only survive but thrive in the face of growing external pressures. As the years passed, the once unstoppable rise of Pyrrhus began to falter. His ambition, which had driven him to challenge the might of Rome and carve out an empire in the western Mediterranean, began to unravel under the weight of his own relentless pursuit of glory. The triumphs that had once promised him a legacy of greatness now seemed like distant memories. Pyrrhus's military genius had been overshadowed by the immense costs of his continuous wars, and his empire, though formidable in size, was crumbling under the strain of its own ambitions. The people of Epirus, once proud of their king and his successes, began to lose faith. Pyrrhus's victory at Heraclea had proven his ability to defeat the Romans. But the true cost of that victory was becoming painfully clear. The battle had drained his army, leaving him with fewer soldiers and less support from his allies. The Romans, though temporarily beaten, had not been vanquished. They were regrouping, and their expansion across the Italian peninsula continued unabated. As Pyrrhus's forces were depleted by endless battles, the Romans had become more efficient and resourceful, and their resolve only grew stronger. The Battle of Asculum in 279 BC, though a victory for Pyrrhus, had proven to be another costly engagement. His army, though victorious, was left severely weakened, and Pyrrhus's inability to capitalize on his successes began to take a toll on his reputation. The kingdom of Epirus, once a vibrant and powerful force in the Mediterranean, was now caught in a cycle of exhaustion, with resources stretched thin and morale dwindling. Pyrrhus, consumed by his desire for military glory, had become blind to the realities of governance. His attention remained focused on his ambitions rather than the needs of his people, and his isolation grew. Lanassa, who had been a witness to his rise and fall, understood better than anyone the depths of Pyrrhus's internal struggle. While he had once been a king with a vision of greatness, he had become a man ensnared by his own dreams of conquest. His relentless pursuit of military victories had driven a wedge between them, and their marriage, already strained by his absence and obsession with war, had become a shadow of what it once was. Lanassa had seen Pyrrhus at his best and his worst, and she knew that the path he was on could only lead to one inevitable conclusion: his eventual downfall. For Pyrrhus, the reality of his situation became evident during the final years of his reign. His kingdom, once the jewel of Epirus, was deteriorating. The people who had once cheered him on now murmured among themselves, questioning the wisdom of his decisions. His repeated military failures, coupled with the economic strain caused by years of warfare, had left Epirus vulnerable to external threats. Even the Greek city-states that had once been his allies were beginning to distance themselves, realizing that Pyrrhus's ambitions could no longer guarantee their security. The Romans, aware of Pyrrhus's weakened position, seized the opportunity to strike back. Though the Romans had suffered defeat in previous battles, they had learned from their mistakes. Their military reforms, combined with their unwavering resolve, allowed them to recover from the losses inflicted by Pyrrhus. Slowly but surely, the Romans began to push back against Pyrrhus's forces, encroaching on his territory and challenging his dominance. As Pyrrhus's fortunes continued to decline, Lanassa's role in the Mediterranean grew more significant. Her return to Syracuse had been a decision that set the course of her own life, but it also had profound implications for the future of the region. As Pyrrhus's empire crumbled, Lanassa had solidified her position as a leader in her own right. The political maneuvers she had made in Syracuse, including her alliances with Carthage and other Greek city-states, had strengthened the city-state's position in the Mediterranean. Lanassa's leadership had brought stability to Syracuse, and her diplomatic acumen had ensured that the city remained a powerful force, even as the Mediterranean balance of power shifted. Despite her personal disillusionment with Pyrrhus, Lanassa never fully abandoned him. She had known him as a partner in both politics and marriage, and she had once believed in his dreams of empire. But the man who had once been her king had become a shadow of himself, isolated, consumed by his own failures, and disconnected from the people he had sworn to protect. The realization that Pyrrhus's empire was collapsing under the weight of his own decisions was a painful one for Lanassa. She had hoped, in some distant part of her heart, that he could still find redemption, that his ambitions could be reined in and redirected for the good of his people. But those hopes had long since faded, replaced by the bitter knowledge that Pyrrhus's fall was inevitable. The final blow came in 272 BC when Pyrrhus, after a series of defeats and political failures, was killed in battle. His death, though not unexpected, marked the end of an era for both Epirus and the Mediterranean world. Pyrrhus's vision of a grand empire was gone, and his kingdom, once so vibrant and full of promise, was left in ruins. The people of Epirus, though devastated by the loss of their king, were left to pick up the pieces of a kingdom that had been consumed by war and ambition. Lanassa, upon hearing the news of Pyrrhus's death, experienced a profound sense of closure. The man she had once loved, the man whose dreams she had supported for so long, was gone. But she also understood that his death marked the end of a cycle of violence and destruction that had plagued Epirus for years. Pyrrhus's downfall, though tragic, had freed both the kingdom and Lanassa herself from the burden of his ambitions. With Pyrrhus's death, Lanassa was once again left to define her own path. The political landscape of the Mediterranean had shifted dramatically, but Lanassa's influence had only grown. She had once been the queen consort of a man who dreamed of empire, but now she was a queen in her own right, a ruler who had navigated the complexities of power, both personal and political, with grace and determination. In the wake of Pyrrhus's death, Lanassa was faced with the task of rebuilding not only the political alliances of Syracuse but also her own sense of purpose. The struggles she had faced, both in her marriage and in her political career, had shaped her into a leader unlike any other. She had seen the rise and fall of great men, and she had come to understand that true power lay not in conquest and glory, but in the ability to adapt, to survive, and to lead with wisdom and compassion. Her journey, once defined by her role as the consort of Pyrrhus, had now become her own. The future of Syracuse, and perhaps even the Mediterranean, rested in her hands. And as Lanassa looked out across the city she had once ruled and now returned to, she knew that she was ready to shape that future on her own terms. Lanassa's journey had been one of extraordinary complexity, marked by personal sacrifice, political intrigue, and the unraveling of empires. The queen consort who had once been caught in the ambitious web of Pyrrhus's dreams now stood alone, a powerful and wise leader who had weathered the storms of her time. Her life, intertwined with the rise and fall of one of history's most ambitious figures, had shaped the Mediterranean world in ways that few could have predicted. As she surveyed the horizon from her palace in Syracuse, Lanassa knew that the story of her life was not just one of survival, it was one of resilience, adaptation, and legacy. Syracuse, once on the brink of collapse, had emerged stronger under her leadership. When Lanassa first returned to the city, the political climate had been fragile, the alliances tenuous, and the threat of Roman and Carthaginian dominance looming large. Yet, through careful diplomacy, shrewd political alliances, and her deep understanding of the Mediterranean's power dynamics, she had restored Syracuse's place as a respected power. Her deft handling of the situation had allowed the city-state to thrive in an era of uncertainty. Though she had once been the wife of Pyrrhus of Epirus, Lanassa had transcended that role. Her legacy was not defined by her connection to a king whose empire had crumbled under its own weight, but by her ability to rise from the ashes of her past and secure the future of her people. The city-state of Syracuse, still a key player in the Mediterranean, had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those who understood the fragile nature of power and the strength required to hold on to it. As the years passed, Lanassa's leadership began to be recognized far beyond the borders of Syracuse. Other city-states, particularly those in the Greek world, sought her counsel. Her name became synonymous with political wisdom, and her decisions were studied by generations of leaders who admired her ability to maintain peace in the face of overwhelming odds. Lanassa's rise to power was not just a personal triumph, it was a testament to the importance of diplomacy, of understanding when to fight and when to negotiate, and of knowing when to step away from a battle that could destroy everything. However, even in her final years, Lanassa was not immune to the relentless forces of change. The Mediterranean world was in the midst of a shift. The rise of Rome as the preeminent power was inevitable, and the smaller Greek city-states like Syracuse could no longer stand alone. Though she had done everything in her power to protect Syracuse, Lanassa knew that the days of independent Greek city-states were numbered. Rome's unyielding march of expansion would eventually sweep over them all. And yet, in her heart, she believed that the legacy of Syracuse would endure. not in its military strength or its political might, but in the ideals that had been upheld under her rule, the ideals of resilience, wisdom, and adaptability. Lanassa spent her final years reflecting on her journey, the choices she had made, the battles she had fought, and the relationships she had forged. She had loved deeply, lost greatly, and risen above the challenges of both war and politics. In the quiet of her later years, she often wondered if her life had been one of true happiness or if it had been a series of compromises, dictated by the demands of power. But in the end, she knew that her role had been one of duty, a duty to her people, to Syracuse, and to the legacy of her family. She had done what she had believed to be right, and in that she found peace. As she passed from the world, the city of Syracuse mourned her loss. The people who had once feared the shifting tides of political power now honored the woman who had given everything to protect them. The future of Syracuse, like the future of all city-states in the Mediterranean, was uncertain, but Lanassa's contributions would not be forgotten. She had shaped the course of history, and her name would be remembered not for the empire that never was, but for the strength and wisdom she had shown in the face of adversity. Lanassa's legacy lived on through the generations that followed. Though the great city of Syracuse would eventually fall to the rising tide of Roman power, the ideals she had instilled in its people remained. In the centuries that followed, Syracuse would be remembered not only for its glory days as a powerful Greek city-state, but for the queen who had led it through its darkest times and who had left behind a legacy of resilience, leadership, and foresight. In the grand tapestry of history, the story of Lanassa was one that would endure not as a tale of a queen consort who had once stood by the side of a great conqueror, but as a story of a woman who had stood alone and shaped the future of a city and a world that was ever-changing.